The Lord of the Rings. The Rings of the Rings. Episode 4, with some surprising decisions and moments. We broadly have three storylines. We've got Galadriel in Numenor, we have the Southlands, and we have Elrond and Durin's friendship. And with only 4 episodes left, now halfway done, the story is still quite slow. Now, I'm no stranger to slow-paced stories. They don't bother me that much. My favourite film is Blade Runner 2049, and it's hardly like Tolkien is known for writing fast-paced stories. But before I talk about what is definitely the strongest storyline in the show, I want to talk about why it feels so slow, and where some problems might be with that. Number 1, the inciting incident. There isn't really one. An event that triggers the story, that motivates our characters, that changes the stakes. Now, the story sort of treats Meteor Man's arrival as the inciting incident. The trailers certainly do. We get introduced to all of our main characters in the first episode, and then at the end, they all see it streak across the sky. It's something that connects them. But outside of the Halffoot storyline, it doesn't really change what our main characters are doing. Galadriel's story promises momentum around the hunt for Sauron, but that is very quickly interrupted by Numenor, which kinda stalls the story till basically the end of this episode. Elrond goes to Khazad-dum, but there's not really a strong thread of tension there, and that's not a bad thing. It's even the most enjoyable plotline, but we don't get a great sense of forward momentum from it. The Southlands and the Halfwoods fare a bit better, and they have some momentum, but we spend the least amount of time with those storylines, and they're not super connected to Galadriel. I want to draw a comparison, and the clearest parallel is Game of Thrones, right? In the first episode, we establish all of our characters, our Lannisters and our Starks and our Baratheons, their relationships, and then Jaime attempts to murder Bran. And we know by this point what the ramifications and complications will be between all of our characters, and that creates momentum. And that's just not really here in Rings of Power, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I can totally understand why people might be a little bit bored or just wanting things to happen. There's not really a lot of tension that knits all of our stories together and drives them forward, which makes it kind of just less interesting. And the second reason is about the reveals in Rings of Power. Forward momentum comes from asking a question, where is Sauron? And then giving us, a trickle of little tidbits of interesting information that are leading up to something, that promise interesting answers. But like the reveal that the sign is a map of Mordor just isn't that interesting. We already know from the Southlands that evil is growing in that region, and if you have even a passing knowledge of, Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings, you probably associate Sauron with Mordor in some way. It could have been interesting if they played with the dramatic irony of us knowing that something is going down in the Southlands, but the elves need to figure that out and they're trying to piece it together, and then they finally do and there's a release of that, but I don't think that they played into that. Even though we have a lot of plot developments in each of these narrative threads, it doesn't feel like they're complicating the tension to come, that they're complicating each other's tension, or that they're necessarily leading up to something big. It also doesn't help how we're stopping and starting so much as we jump between storylines that don't have a strong impact on each other. We're still getting introduced to main characters in episode 3, so there is slowly paced, but then there's also poorly paced or just boring writing. And halfway through the story, 5 hours in, I can definitely understand why some people might be turned off by this. Personally, I don't think it's working very well at the moment. There is one redeeming thing, which is that in this episode, at the very end, Numenor decides to go fight for the Southlands. This is a good step because, it brings 2 of our storylines together, it returns to that question that we were initially asked, it ramps up the tension, and it promises events in the future. I don't know what it's going to turn out to be like. How do you guys feel about it? Let me know down below, but I really hope that the pace does pick up now. But the strongest storyline in the show is undoubtedly, and I know this is not from Khazad-dum, it's from Erebor, but it's Dwarven, it's the Khazad-dum story, it's Elrond and Durin, which, by the way, seem to have gotten a pretty warm reception amongst fans and, more broadly. There is this one scene in this episode, which I really, really liked, where the dwarves are singing to the stones, to the mountain, after some miners get trapped in a cave. It's this beautiful moment of soft magic. The singing is ethereal, it's enchanting, and it really did feel kind of truly Tolkienian. Music and poetry are a huge part of Tolkien's writings. Like, the universe was sung into being, and there's tons of stories where music and poetry and voice have real, literal, magical power. And so I think this was a great expansion on those themes that Tolkien clearly loved. I actually think it was one of the strongest scenes in the series more broadly, because it, was accompanied by Arondir and company fleeing into the light, out into the dawn to avoid the orcs who hate the light. And there's a poetry to that I think really nailed and captured kind of the mythic and otherworldly tone of Tolkien's world. Just the framing of it, if you've watched it. Of course, the main reason that the Khazad-dum storyline works so much better, right, is because of the characters. Of course, it's the characters, It's how we get immersed in stories, and Elrond and Durin's relationship is charming, as is Durin and Diza's marriage. And at the end of the episode, we have this scene between Durin and his father, where his father draws in him close and he says, "Ever am I with you, my son, even in anger, perhaps even especially so." And I think it was just a really genuinely heartfelt moment that really works with the story. You like it, it's good. It's just this genuinely heartfelt moment with this bit of dialogue that you kind of feel like Tolkien could write. It's even got kind of a biblical edge to it. This storyline in this episode also really keyed into some of the lore, because the dwarves believe that their king is kind of the reincarnation of Durin, their first king. And there's a line in this episode where he says, "We believe that when a king is coronated, all the beliefs and wisdom and mistakes of your forefathers flow into you." And that's kind of a way of paying homage to that, even if it's not entirely lore accurate. There were also some really nice visual details, like how they filmed Elrond's elfin ability to hear and see at a distance. Now, I've talked before about why some of the writing in the other stories is pretty clunky. It's because they're often so interrupted by plot and exposition that we never get to spend any time on characters. But that doesn't really seem as much the case in the Khazad-dum storyline. Every beat seems to serve these characters and relationships, and as a result, the pacing doesn't matter so much because it's just enjoyable to watch these characters interact. Something that I am just not feeling with the Numenor story. And that does bring us to what I feel is the weakest Rings of Power storyline, Numenor. So, I talked last episode about how the Rings of Power just feels a little bit shallow, and I think that scene with Diza was a fantastic example of the depth and subtext and layers to the story that I'd like to see, but the shallowness really comes out in the writing of the Numenor story. For one, we just don't know the characters very well. We were only introduced to 6 of them, yes, 6, in episode 3. And a lot of the scenes are, again, interrupted by plot and exposition, and we haven't really been given a chance to get to know them, when I think the writers and the story kind of expect us to by this point, because, the end of this episode is meant to be this momentous turning point, and we're meant to feel something when Isildur signs up to fight, and Elendil and Tamriel make this decision, but I'm just not really feeling that, 2, the conflict in Numenor feels simplistic. So in this episode, we see Ar-Pharazôn whipping up the crowd with anti-elf sentiment and someone raging against the elves in the street, But the way the crowd responds, the way people talked, the way the crowd all punches in the air all at once the same way, it felt to me kind of like a YA book imagining of how politics works, or how a whipped up crowd might look. It feels kind of like watching a high school play where I'm very aware that this is staged, and it's quite the same with many of the court scenes in Numenor too. Okay, so the elves are gonna take our jobs angle that they seem to have gone with this episode is just pretty lackluster to me, especially because it's such a leap in logic for these people who have lived on an isolated island that has one elf turn up after hundreds of years, for them to make. Show me the ruling class drunk on their own accomplishments or obsessed with a past that their ancestors built but they think they earned. Tombs so grand as a way of continuing past this mortal life. Numenor is meant to be interesting because they think they're better than everyone else, and that lie is so easy to believe because in many ways they truly are magnificent. In contrast, the elves are gonna take our jobs makes the Numenorians feel petty, dumb and thick, and not in a way the writers intended. It doesn't make them intimidating, it doesn't make them interesting, and it doesn't make them narratively or philosophically compelling as a source of tension. And with so much of the narrative thrust being seemingly dependent on us being invested in Numenor, I think it risks a lot of other things falling flat too. Economic concerns can be a really interesting narrative, but I don't get the sense that they're really going to take it in that direction. At the moment, this conflict has the depth of a slogan. Especially because I feel like we've been told that there's a lot of tension on the island, but I don't think that we've been shown it very well. Like, not in a way that meaningfully impacts our characters. We do get a little bit of that with Tamariel in this episode, but it's not enough for me, not when you're expecting me to care about this momentous moment, right? 3, the dialogue and a lot of scenes more broadly in Numenor they're quite clunky. It, again, lacks the subtlety that I feel like we see in the Khazad-dum storyline, that we often get with Arondir as well. Other people have brought up how characters will use words like yeah, nah, and okay, which are very modern and distinctly out of place. But I want to show you one exchange in particular from this episode that stood out to me between Elendil's daughter Eärien and Ar-Pharazôn's daughter Kemet or something. Listen to this. This is after she bumps into him and spills a bunch of water on him. I'm so sorry. It's alright. It's alright. It's alright. And here I thought that your talents ended at draftsmanship. Scrubbing is good for dexterity, or so the guildmaster says. So, how about this? I do the floors, you do the goblets, and the last one to finish pays for dinner. I'm not in the habit of going off with strange young men. Very wise. If I see any, you'll be the first to know. Change a few words here, and this dialogue, to me, sounds straight out of a bump into your high school crush scene from a chick flick. This is similar to the thing I mentioned last episode, where Halbrand was cornered by these Numenorian men, and they shove him around in a scene that looks almost straight out of like a high school bully scene. Now I want to say the elves and dwarves do have better dialogue. The scene where Durin gets Elrond to swear on the mountain, he makes an oath. Like, that was really nicely done. But it makes Numenor just a lot less compelling, you know? And it feels more artificial, it feels more surface level. Now, of course, it's not all bad. There was this nice exchange between Galadriel and Tamariel, where Galadriel says, choose not the path of fear, but of faith, and Tamariel says, faith is too fine a thread to hang a kingdom on. And I loved the effects that they used for the Palantir. I like the moral complexity and why Numenor wants to fight, that it's rooted in arrogance, thinking that they're better than everyone else, and this is kind of one way to prove it, rather than kindness. But even though I am enjoying parts of the show, it feels like so much of it is in Numenor, so much of it centers around them. And the shallowness in the Numenor story means that I'm just not enthralled. And lastly, we have the Southlands story, where we finally get to meet Orc Daddy, Adar, who is an elf. Now, there's a few things that this could mean, but the one that came to mind for me was that back in the first stage, when the elves were first, meeting the Valar, some of them didn't go with the Valar, and some of them were just like, nah, we don't trust you, and they are known as the Avari. We get basically no information about them, but theoretically, they were corrupted by Morgoth, and in some earlier drafts, they are what Morgoth made the first orcs out of. My bet is that Adar will probably just be a one-season villain, but if he is Sauron, well, we'll have to see how that plays out. There were some nice lore references to Beleriand, the continent that was sunk during the war with Morgoth, to Orodruin, which is, you better know it as Mount Doom, and Adar says, there are lies that run so deep that even the roots and the trees believe them, which is a really interesting concept to bring up. I hope they use that to explore, if they do use it more, to explore Tolkien's deeper philosophy in the mythos about, why Morgoth turned and what's that commentary that he's giving there. I've talked before about how I like that they're exploring the concept of orc clans and tribes and loyalty. So this scene where, they're kind of sad that this orc is dying, and Adar comes to basically end him and give him a merciful death. That was interesting to see. I don't know how I feel about it overall, but yeah. The theory, by the way, with Theo, the kid, is that he might be one of the Ringwraiths to come. What do you think of that? We also do have more evidence that Halbrand is possibly Sauron, because in this episode, he says to Galadriel, you've got to learn what your enemy fears and use it to control them, basically. And what does Sauron do? Well, that's exactly what he does with the rings. It's about people fearing death. And he also does that with Numenor, He goes up to them and he says,
do you fear death?
Personally, I hope that Sauron is a character we haven't met yet. Celebrimbor mentions that this forge he wants needs to be completed by spring, but where is that urgency coming from? Hopefully, it could be a Sauron that we haven't met, whose name will be Anatar. It would be kind of interesting if we just get introduced to a character at the end of the season who's like, and this is my work partner, Anatar. And we're like, oh, that dramatic irony. What did you think of episode 4? Let me know down below what worked, what didn't, how are you feeling going towards the second half of the season. Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.